Hey everyone, and welcome to another deep dive. Today we're going to be exploring a pretty interesting and controversial idea in cancer research. The idea that cancer might actually be a metabolic disease at its core.
That's right. We'll be going deep into an academic review article called Cancer as a Metabolic Disease, Implications for Novel Therapeutics.
Yeah, and we're going to try to distill it down to what it could mean for you.
Absolutely.
So the paper jumps right into something called the Warburg effect. Um, you know, I, I kind of understand this one because
Mm.
I'm a bit of a workout fanatic, and ever pushed yourself so hard that your muscles just burn.
Oh, yeah, of course. Lactic acid buildup.
Exactly. Lactic acid. And that's like a byproduct of your cells doing this less efficient way of making energy called fermentation.
Right.
And they do this when they're starved for oxygen. But here's the thing. Cancer cells seem to prefer fermentation, even when there's plenty of oxygen around.
Yeah. It's really interesting, isn't it?
It's like they're deliberately choosing the less efficient path.
Yeah, and that's exactly what makes the Warburg effect so controversial. So, is this weird energy production just a side effect of cancer, or could it be a driving force? And this paper argues for the latter, that damaged cellular respiration might actually be a root cause forcing those cancer cells into this less efficient fermentation mode.
Okay, so that already flips the script on how we think about cancer developing. But why would respiration be damaged in the first place?
Well, that's a great question. And to understand that, we need to zoom in on these tiny powerhouses inside our cells called mitochondria.
Oh, yeah, the mitochondria.
Exactly. They're basically the energy factories responsible for respiration. And what researchers have found is that in tumor tissue, these mitochondria are often structurally abnormal,
Hmm.
and they're fewer in number.
Is there a visual for this in the paper? I feel like I remember seeing like some electron microscope images.
Yes, there are. And healthy mitochondria have these intricate folded structures called cristae.
Right.
But in cancer cells, the mitochondria look swollen and the cristae are broken down. It's a pretty stark visual.
Damaged powerhouses, less efficient energy production. It's starting to connect back to the Warburg effect. But this next part, this is where it gets really interesting to me. This paper goes on to challenge the whole gene theory of cancer. The idea that mutations in our DNA are like the main drivers of the disease.
Right, right. So the dominant theory is that those mutations lead to uncontrolled cell growth, and boom, you have cancer.
Right.
But this paper is arguing that those nuclear mutations might actually be a result of this whole metabolic dysfunction, not the initial cause.
Hold on, are you saying that genes might not be the primary culprit here? Like, what evidence do they have for that?
Well, they cite these fascinating experiments where researchers basically did a cell swap. They took the nucleus from a tumor cell, which should be full of those cancer-causing mutations, and put it into a healthy cell with normal cytoplasm.
And what happened? Did it cause cancer in the healthy cell?
No, surprisingly, it didn't. The tumor growth was actually suppressed.
Wow.
But get this, when they did the reverse, putting a normal nucleus into the cytoplasm of a cancer cell, tumors developed.
Oh, wow. That's mind-blowing.
Yeah.
So you're telling me that the environment of the cell, particularly the cytoplasm with its messed up mitochondria, had a bigger impact on tumor development than the genetic material itself.
That's what this paper is arguing, yeah.
Okay, so we've got damaged mitochondria, potentially leading to the Warburg effect, and now this radical idea that the cellular environment might be more important than the genes themselves. This is heavy stuff. Where do we even go from here?
Well, this is where the paper dives into a really crucial point that impacts how we interpret a lot of cancer research, and that is the influence of the environment, especially in lab settings.
Right, because a lot of this research happens in vitro, petri dishes and all that.
Precisely. But this paper raises a concern that those lab environments are often loaded with glucose. It's like giving the cells a sugar feast. And that might be skewing our understanding of how cancer cells really behave.
So it's like those cells are living in a sugary spa, which is not exactly representative of conditions inside our bodies. But how does that affect the results?
Well, think of it like this. Imagine you're trying to study a fish
Okay.
by taking it out of water and putting it in a tank full of soda. You might observe some interesting behavior, but it wouldn't really reflect how the fish actually functions in its natural environment.
Yeah, that's a much better analogy than the Crabtree effect this paper kept mentioning.
Right.
So you're saying that this artificial lab environment could be giving us misleading results about cancer cell metabolism.
Yeah, exactly.
And this is super relevant, right, for anyone listening
Yes.
who's trying to make sense of all the cancer research out there.
Yeah.
You might come across studies with seemingly conflicting findings. And this is one reason why
Absolutely.
environment matters.
Absolutely.
Okay, so we've got to consider the context. But the paper doesn't stop there, does it? This paper goes even deeper down the rabbit hole, right, into the realm of evolution.
It does, and it gets pretty philosophical.
Yeah.
We're talking Darwin versus Lamarck, two very different ideas about how traits are inherited and how evolution works.
Okay, so refresh my memory here. Darwin was all about survival of the fittest, right? Random mutations leading to advantageous traits that get passed down.
Right. But what's fascinating here is that this paper actually makes a case for Lamarckian evolution in cancer.
Wait, Lamarck? Wasn't he the guy who thought giraffes got long necks from stretching for leaves, and then their kids inherited those stretched necks?
Exactly. He believed that traits acquired during an organism's life could be passed down.
Okay.
And this paper suggests that something similar might be happening with cancer cells and their mitochondria.
Okay, I'm officially intrigued. How does that work in the context of cancer?
The idea is that when those mitochondria get damaged and the cells shift to fermentation, those changes aren't just temporary. They actually get passed down to daughter cells, making the tumor progressively more and more reliant on fermentation and less on that respiration.
So it's not just random mutations driving cancer's development. It's actively adapting to its metabolic circumstances and passing those adaptations on to its offspring.
Precisely.
Pretty wild, right?
It is.
Okay, so we've gone from messed up mitochondria to questioning the role of genes, and now we're talking about Lamarckian evolution. This deep dive is living up to its name. But if we accept this idea of cancer as a metabolic disease, what are the practical implications? What can we do with this information?
Well, that's where things get really exciting because this is where the paper starts talking about potential metabolic therapies that actually target cancer's weaknesses.
Okay, let's hear it. What kind of therapies are we talking about?
Well, one that's been gaining a lot of attention is the ketogenic diet. Have you heard of that?
Yeah, keto diets. I've heard of that for weight loss. But how does that tie into fighting cancer?
So our bodies typically run on glucose, which comes from carbohydrates. But when you drastically reduce those carbs and increase your fat intake, your liver starts churning out these molecules called ketones.
Okay.
And they become your body's primary energy source. It's kind of like switching from gasoline to electric power.
Gotcha. Okay. But why can't most tumor cells use those ketones?
Well, it seems that many cancer cells, because of their damaged mitochondria and that reliance on fermentation, have lost the ability to efficiently break down ketones for energy. They're stuck in that glucose guzzling mode.
So we're switching the gas station on them.
Right.
That's pretty ingenious.
Yeah.
Now, are there any downsides to keto? I know people talk about the keto flu and feeling kind of crummy at first.
Yeah, there can be some initial side effects as your body adapts to this new way of fueling itself.
Sure.
And it's important to do it safely and under the guidance of a healthcare professional.
Of course.
And not everyone is a good candidate for the ketogenic diet. But for some people, it could be a really powerful tool in their fight against cancer.
Absolutely. It's not a magic bullet or anything, but definitely something to talk to your doctor about.
Yeah.
Now, you also mentioned hyperbaric oxygen therapy. That one sounds almost counterintuitive. Wouldn't more oxygen actually help cancer cells grow faster?
That's a great question and a very common misconception. But remember we talked about how cancer cells prefer that fermentation, even in the presence of oxygen?
Right, right.
They've become somewhat adapted to a low oxygen environment.
Because their mitochondria are damaged and can't handle all that oxygen efficiently.
Exactly. So the idea behind hyperbaric oxygen therapy is to actually overload them with oxygen.
Oh.
It's kind of like flooding a system that's not designed to handle that much input.
So it's more like we're overwhelming them with something they can't process rather than
Yep.
feeding them.
Right.
I see.
Exactly. And healthy cells are generally better equipped to handle higher oxygen levels, so they're less likely to be harmed. It's still experimental, but it's a promising approach.
Now, besides keto and hyperbaric oxygen, you also mentioned drugs that actually target cancer cell metabolism directly.
Yes.
Can you tell us a bit more about those?
Absolutely. So there's a whole class of drugs being developed that aim to disrupt specific metabolic pathways that cancer cells really rely on.
Okay.
For example, some of these drugs inhibit glucose uptake, or they block the enzymes involved in glucose metabolism.
So these drugs are basically throwing a wrench into the machinery that cancer cells use to break down and utilize glucose.
That's a great way to put it, yes.
And they're also drugs that target glutamine metabolism. Glutamine is another amino acid that many cancer cells are particularly dependent on.
Yes.
So we're hitting them from multiple angles here, disrupting their preferred energy sources and also interfering with their ability to use those fuels. It's a pretty elegant strategy.
Yes.
And what's exciting is that this approach could potentially work in conjunction with traditional therapies, like chemotherapy and radiation.
Exactly.
Because by weakening cancer cells metabolically, we might make them more susceptible to those other treatments. It's a 1-2 punch.
That's the idea.
Now, I know this field is still developing, so I'm sure there are challenges and potential risks.
Absolutely. And we need to understand the long-term effects of these therapies and how to personalize them for each individual's unique metabolism.
Right. It's not as simple as just, like, popping a pill. But it feels like this opens up a whole new world of possibilities for treating and maybe even preventing cancer.
It does. And what makes this paper so thought-provoking is that it's not just about new therapies, it's a whole new way of thinking about cancer itself.
This deep dive has definitely blown my mind. It's like everything I thought I knew about cancer is being challenged. I can't wait to see where this research leads in the future.
Me too. It's an incredibly exciting time to be following this field.
Okay. Well, we've covered a ton of ground today, from the Warburg effect and those wonky mitochondria to questioning the role of genes and exploring those radical new therapies.
Yeah.
I feel like we've barely scratched the surface, though.
I know, we've just started.
But there's more to come. So stay tuned for part 2 of this deep dive. We'll be back soon.
Absolutely.
Okay, so we're back and still on this deep dive into cancer as a metabolic disease. It's a lot to wrap your head around, but it's so fascinating. Last we left off, we were talking about those potential metabolic therapies and how they target cancers like unique energy needs.
Right. And one thing I think is especially relevant is this idea of the ketogenic diet. You mentioned you'd heard of it for weight loss, but it's becoming increasingly interesting in the cancer world.
Yeah, and the idea of like starving cancer cells by forcing the body to use fat for fuel is pretty compelling. But let's break that down a bit more. How exactly does keto work? And what makes it so difficult for cancer cells to utilize those ketones?
So our bodies typically run on glucose, which comes from carbohydrates.
Yeah.
But when you drastically reduce carbs and increase fat intake, your liver starts churning out these molecules called ketones, and they become your body's primary energy source.
Okay.
It's kind of like switching from gasoline to electric power.
Okay, I'm with you so far. But why can't most tumor cells use these ketones?
Well, it seems that many cancer cells, because of their damaged mitochondria and that reliance on fermentation, have lost the ability to efficiently break down ketones for energy. They're essentially stuck in that glucose guzzling mode.
So it's like they're wired for a specific type of fuel and we're switching the gas station on them.
Yeah, exactly.
That's pretty ingenious.
It is, yeah.
Are there any downsides to keto? I know people talk about the keto flu and feeling kind of crummy at first.
Yeah, there can be some initial side effects as your body adapts to this new way of fueling itself.
Right.
And it's important to do it safely and under the guidance of a healthcare professional.
Of course.
Not everyone is a good candidate for keto, but for some people, it could be a powerful tool in their fight against cancer.
Absolutely. It's not a magic bullet or anything, but definitely something to discuss with your doctor. Now, you also mentioned hyperbaric oxygen therapy.
Yes.
That one sounds almost counterintuitive. Wouldn't more oxygen actually help cancer cells grow faster?
That's a great question and a common misconception, but remember, we talked about how cancer cells prefer that fermentation even in the presence of oxygen.
Right, right.
So they've become somewhat adapted to a low oxygen environment.
Right, because their mitochondria are damaged and they can't handle all that oxygen very efficiently.
Exactly. So the idea behind hyperbaric oxygen therapy is to overload them with oxygen.
Okay.
Kind of like flooding a system that's not designed to handle that much input.
So it's more like we're overwhelming them with something they can't process rather than feeding them.
Exactly.
Okay.
And healthy cells are generally better equipped to handle those higher oxygen levels, so they're less likely to be harmed.
Makes sense.
Again, more research is needed, but it's a promising approach.
Now, besides keto and hyperbaric oxygen, you also mentioned drugs that target cancer cell metabolism directly.
Right.
Can you tell us a bit more about those?
Absolutely. So there's a whole class of drugs being developed that aim to disrupt the specific metabolic pathways that cancer cells rely on. For example, some of these drugs inhibit glucose uptake, or they block the enzymes that are involved in glucose metabolism.
So these drugs are basically throwing a wrench in the machinery that cancer cells use to break down and utilize glucose.
That's a great way to put it, yes.
And you said there are also drugs that target glutamine metabolism.
Yeah.
Glutamine is another amino acid that many cancer cells are particularly dependent on.
Yes, that's right.
So we're hitting them from multiple angles here, disrupting their preferred energy sources and also interfering with their ability to use those fuels. It's a pretty elegant strategy.
It is.
And what's exciting is that this approach could potentially work in conjunction with traditional therapies like chemo and radiation.
Right.
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 Because by weakening the cancer cells metabolically, we might make them more susceptible to those other treatments.
That's right.
It's a real 1-2 punch.
Yeah. It's exciting, isn't it?
As with any emerging field, I'm sure there are challenges and potential risks.
Absolutely. We need to understand the long-term effects of these therapies and how to personalize them for each individual's unique metabolism.
It's not as simple as just, popping a pill,
Ah,
but it feels like this opens up a whole new world of possibilities for treating and maybe even preventing cancer.
I think so too. And, this whole shift in thinking about cancer as a metabolic disease, it really empowers us to take control of our own health. Because unlike our genes, which are largely determined at birth, we have a lot more influence over our metabolism.
You're right. What we eat, how we exercise, how we manage stress, all these things impact our metabolic health and could potentially play a role in reducing our risk of cancer.
Exactly. And that's a really powerful message.
It is.
This isn't just about finding new cures. It's about understanding that we have a role to play in our own well-being.
I love that. It's empowering. Now, before we move on, I want to go back to something you said earlier about the importance of the cellular environment and how lab conditions can sometimes, skew the results of cancer research.
Right, and I think that's a really important takeaway for, anyone listening who's clearly invested in understanding, the nuances of this field. You might come across studies with seemingly contradictory findings, and it's helpful to keep in mind that the environment in which those studies were conducted could play a role in those seemingly contradictory results.
So just because a certain drug shows promise in a petri dish doesn't necessarily mean it'll work the same way in a complex human body.
Exactly. There are so many factors to consider, and the cellular environment is a big one.
Right. Okay, I'm filing that away in my mental notes. Always consider the context.
Good idea.
Now, I know this whole deep dive is based on just one academic review article.
Right.
And it is presenting, a somewhat controversial view of cancer. But I'm curious, where does this research go from here? What are the next steps in exploring this, metabolic approach to cancer?
Well, for one, we need more research, both in the lab and in clinical trials.
Of course.
We need to validate these findings, test these therapies, and really understand the intricacies of cancer cell metabolism.
Yeah, because it's one thing to have a theory, but we need to see how it plays out in the real world, right?
Absolutely. And another crucial area is personalized medicine. As we've discussed, everyone's metabolism is unique, so the future of cancer treatment likely lies in tailoring therapies to each individual's specific metabolic profile.
So it's about finding the right tools for the right job, so to speak.
Exactly. And I imagine technology is going to play a big role in that.
Yeah, for sure.
We're already seeing advancements in things like genetic testing and metabolic profiling, allowing us to gather more data about each person's unique biology. And as that technology continues to evolve, it's going to become even more sophisticated and more accessible.
So we're talking about a future where cancer treatment is not just about attacking the tumor, but about understanding the individual's entire metabolic landscape and tailoring the treatment accordingly.
Precisely. It's a much more holistic approach, recognizing that cancer isn't just a disease of the cells, it's a disease of the whole system. And that's where I think this research is leading us to a more comprehensive and personalized understanding of cancer and how to treat it.
That's a really inspiring vision. Okay, well, we've talked about the research, the therapies, the future directions. But before we wrap up this part of the deep dive, I want to bring it back to you, the listener. What's the one big takeaway you want them to walk away with?
I think it's this. Our understanding of cancer is constantly evolving. And while this metabolic perspective is still somewhat controversial, it offers a powerful new lens through which to view this complex disease. It challenges us to think differently about the causes, the treatments, and even the potential for prevention.
Beautifully said. And on that note, I think it's time for a little break. We'll be back soon with the final part of this deep dive, where we'll explore some even more thought-provoking implications of this metabolic approach to cancer. Stay tuned. We're back for the final part of our deep dive into cancer as a metabolic disease. My brain is buzzing with all these new ideas. It's like we've been looking at this puzzle the wrong way for so long.
It is a real paradigm shift. And, the more we explore this metabolic perspective, the more profound the implications become, especially when we start thinking about, like, prevention.
Right. That's what I wanted to dig into a little bit.
Hmm.
So we've talked about treating existing cancer, but what about stopping it before it even starts?
Yeah.
If cancer is like fundamentally a metabolic disease, does that change how we approach prevention?
Absolutely. It highlights the importance of metabolic health.
Okay.
And it's not just about, weight management or avoiding chronic diseases like diabetes. It's really about creating an environment within our bodies that's less hospitable to
So
cancer.
we're like building up our defenses from the inside out.
Yeah,
But
exactly.
what does that look like? Like practically, what can we do to support our metabolic health?
Well, a lot of it comes down to the basics.
Yeah.
What we eat, how we move, how we manage stress, all these things impact our metabolism at a cellular level.
Okay, let's break that down a little bit. Let's
Yeah.
start with food.
Okay.
What kind of diet supports metabolic health?
It's funny, the same dietary advice that's good for your heart, your overall health, also tends to be beneficial for metabolic health. We're talking about a diet rich in whole, unprocessed foods.
Okay.
Lots of fruits and vegetables, healthy fats, lean proteins.
Okay, so nothing too revolutionary there.
Right.
But what about sugar? I mean, if cancer cells thrive on glucose, should we be avoiding sugar completely?
That's a great question, and it's something a lot of people ask about. It's true that cancer cells love glucose, but it's important to remember that all of our cells need glucose to function.
Hmm.
The key is to avoid excess sugar, particularly refined sugars and processed foods that spike your blood sugar levels.
So it's about balance and moderation,
Yeah.
not necessarily completely eliminating sugar, but like choosing healthier sources and being mindful of our intake.
Exactly. And this is where fiber comes in.
Okay.
Fiber helps slow down the absorption of sugar into the bloodstream, preventing those dramatic spikes that can fuel cancer cell growth.
Got it. So load up on those fruits, veggies, and whole grains.
Yes, absolutely.
What about exercise? How does that factor into metabolic health?
Exercise is crucial. Not only does it help us maintain a healthy weight, which is important, but it also improves insulin sensitivity, which means our cells can use glucose more efficiently. This helps keep those blood sugar levels nice and stable and reduces the amount of fuel that's available to those cancer cells.
So it's not just about burning calories. It's about improving how our body uses energy at like a cellular level.
Yeah.
What kind of exercise is best?
A combination of cardio and strength training is ideal.
Okay.
Cardio helps improve cardiovascular health and burn calories, while strength training builds muscle mass, which further enhances our metabolism.
Gotcha. All right. So get moving, everybody. Find an activity you enjoy and make it a regular part of your routine.
Oh.
Now, the last piece of this puzzle is stress management. How does stress tie into metabolic health?
Chronic stress can really wreak havoc on our bodies, including our metabolism. When we're constantly stressed, our bodies release hormones like cortisol, which can increase those blood sugar levels, and promote inflammation, both of which can create a more favorable environment for cancer cells.
So stress isn't just bad for our mental health. It actually creates like physiological changes that can impact our risk of cancer. What can we do about it?
Well, finding healthy ways to manage stress is really crucial, and this could be things like mindfulness practices, meditation, yoga, spending time in nature, pursuing hobbies that bring you joy, anything that helps you unwind.
So it's about finding those activities that help you de-stress and recharge. Right. So we've got a healthy diet, regular exercise, and stress management. Pretty simple formula.
It is.
And what's so empowering about this metabolic approach to cancer prevention is that these are all things within our control.
Right.
We can make choices every day that support our metabolic health and potentially reduce our risk of developing cancer.
Absolutely. Knowledge is power.
Mm.
And understanding how our metabolism works really gives us the tools to make those informed choices that can have a real impact on our health.
Well said. I think we've covered a lot of ground today. We've explored this fascinating and somewhat controversial idea of cancer as a metabolic disease. We've delved into the science, the potential therapies, and the implications for prevention. But before we wrap up, I want to leave you with a final thought. Something to ponder as you continue your own exploration of this topic.
I love that.
If this metabolic perspective on cancer is correct, it raises a really interesting question. What role do environmental toxins play in disrupting our metabolism and potentially contributing to cancer development?
That's such a great point.
That's something I'm going to be looking into further, and I encourage you to do the same.
We often focus so much on the genetic factors and those lifestyle choices that influence cancer risk, but the impact of our environment is something that we're really only beginning to understand. It's such a crucial piece of the puzzle.
Absolutely. Well, on that note, I think it's time to wrap up this deep dive. It's been an incredible journey, and I want to thank you for being such a fantastic guide.
It's been my pleasure. And thank you for your insightful questions and your enthusiasm. It's always inspiring to see someone so engaged in learning about this really complex and important topic.
And a huge thank you to you, the listener, for joining us on this deep dive. We hope you found it informative, thought-provoking, and maybe even a little bit empowering. Remember, knowledge is power, and the more we understand about our bodies, the better equipped we are to make choices that support our health and well-being. We'll see you next time for another deep dive. Until then, stay curious.
Bye, everyone.